From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Thank you for joining the McLaughlin Group. I apologize for my voice today. A show where friends disagree agreeably. I'm your host, Tom Rogan. This week's panelists are the author and columnist, Pat Buchanan, the Daily Beast's Eleanor Clift, the Chicago Tribune's Clarence Page, and Washington Times contributor, Matt Mackowiak. Okay, let's get to issue 1. FBI, FISA, Fury.
Well, they fabricated evidence and they lied to the courts and they did all sorts of things to have it go their way.
President Trump reacted with fury this week to the publication of a Justice Department report by Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz. The report examined the origins and conduct of the FBI's 2016 investigation into possible Trump campaign collusion with Russia. Horowitz found that while the FBI investigation showed serious shortcomings, there was no evidence of political bias. But note this, U.S. Attorney John Durham is currently conducting a criminal investigation of the FBI investigation, and Durham says he disagrees with some of Horowitz's findings.
Pat, is the president right to be as angry as he is about this report?
I think he's probably not as angry today as he was when it initially came out, or reports came out that there was no bias in the opening of the report. But since then, you've got Durham and Attorney General Barr, who said Horowitz was wrong on the predication, which means on how this all started. Secondly, the report discusses an investigation that is a total debacle. You've got Carter Page in the FISA court. Carter Page, we learned, was an asset of the CIA, and these guys are investigating him as a Russian spy when he's supposed to be talking to the Russians. And so I think it was Ted Cruz said, this thing was run by Beavis and Butthead. Mm-hmm. So I think overall what's happened is it's turned into a positive for Trump. And what is coming in the spring or summer is the Durham report, which basically is going to say, I think, or they indicated it, that there was political bias in the beginning of this report.
Eleanor?
If there's any Beavis and Butthead here, one of them is in the Justice Department, the other one is in Connecticut convening a grand jury looking for something that I don't believe exists. The top line of this Inspector General's report from a very respected gentleman, Mr. Horowitz, who's worked in both Republican and Democratic administrations, that they didn't go into the investigation going after the Trump campaign. It started looking into 4 individuals, Carter Page, Papadopoulos, Michael Flynn, General Flynn, and Paul Manafort. I agree that Mr. Page was treated terribly. I don't see that there's any political motivation here. It looks like a series of errors made in the Justice Department, and the FISA process where you get these secret warrants needs to be examined. And that's it. This was not an effort to get the Trump campaign. The Steele dossier didn't appear until weeks after the FBI had opened its investigation. But politically, there's enough here for Pat and Fox and Trump and the whole gang to continue talking about it for the next several months. And it's a travesty that Durham is now saying his report will land in the spring or summer of an election year. How coincidental.
Well, I would say that the top line for me is that the Steele dossier has been basically totally undermined. And the IG report has proven that the FISA warrants were sought because of the Steele dossier. And that was not what Jim Comey said on television interviews. It's not what was generally understood months ago. In fact, they sought a FISA warrant in August. They weren't able to get it. They got the Steele dossier, and they went back in September, and that's when the FISA warrants began. So look, there's a lot about this that is concerning. If there was criminality, I think Durham will find it. I think that's a good thing. We have to prosecute people who break the law, particularly in this case. In the FISA courts, less than 1% of warrants are not granted. And it is because only the government is there, right? The person who's maybe going to be surveilled isn't there, has no due process, has no lawyer there. And so it is an incredible thing to learn that exculpatory and complete information was not provided to the FISA court. We should be looking at a minimum, disbarment for the government officials and government lawyers who were not providing the full information to the FISA court. And at a maximum, we could be looking at criminal offenses. I think it's very, very serious.
Clarence.
Well, I was disappointed. I was led to believe that this was going to be J. Edgar Hoover reincarnated now and running this what private enterprise called the FBI to go after his political enemies. What I find is that there was a lot of suspicion hovering around the Trump campaign because of the unusual behavior that we've become accustomed to now from Trump and his organization or his associates. But there was this report finds that there was bias on both sides. There were FBI agents who supported Trump and some who supported Hillary's side, which is about what you would expect. There was not a big scandal in that regard. Carter Page, no relation, was East Side called him an asset. He was a gadfly. He was all over the place. And I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff here. And also, just one last thing. Just like a prosecutor goes into a grand jury presenting one side of the case, that's how FBI agents oftentimes get their cases started.
The problem with Democrats is the civil libertarians are now all over this thing. There was spying on the Trump campaign. There was, FBI agents going in and using their assets to go talk to Trump folks with wiretaps on in a presidential campaign.
What was the
There was no
for,
effort.
Though? Who were they reporting to? What information were they looking for?
The point is, that's a good question. Why didn't they go to Trump and say, look, the Russians are moving on some of this stuff, alert your people that something's
What about
going
that
on?
point?
You know why they didn't? You
defensive
know why
briefing.
they didn't? Because there was a suspicion he was in on it.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
Okay, and it turns out he
was
wasn't.
disproven, right?
Well, I don't know about that.
Mueller said no conspiracy, no collusion.
He was receptive. He and his people were receptive to entreaties from Russia. Russia, do you hear me? I'd like to get the 30,000 emails. And I would point out that of the individuals who were under investigation, Paul Manafort is in jail, and General Flynn is awaiting sentencing. And James Comey did what he did about Hillary, making that investigation public, then reopening it, and then closing it, which really helped her lose maybe entirely.
I don't disagree with that.
While the FBI was investigating Trump quietly. If the voters had known that both these investigations were ongoing, we might have had a different outcome in 2016.
Look at this. This country has gone through more than 2 years of division and argument over this whole thing. And look at this thin gruel they came up with as a justification for the FBI doing what they did to the country. And now we got the Ukraine gate. I mean, Putin, they got a troll farm somewhere in ex-Leningrad, and they did this to the United States of America. What a triumph of Soviet or Russian intelligence.
What about Trump's obstruction, though? You talk about no collusion. Yeah. Mueller found ample obstruction enough to justify impeachment.
All right. Matt's turn.
Obstruction of justice.
Trump is so innocent. Why is he hiding?
Matt's turn.
Set the predication aside. What the IG report showed is that the FISA warrants never should have been granted, and they certainly shouldn't have been continued, right? So the reality is you wouldn't have had the Mueller report. You wouldn't have had a special counsel because this wouldn't have kept going. It would have gone maybe for the first FISA warrant. Once the full information was provided, this whole FBI investigation would have ended. We would have been looking at a totally different situation.
Yeah, FISA warrants, plural. There was problem with one FISA warrant, singular, Carter Page. He got screwed. I definitely grant you that. But other people are in jail. A number of indictments were brought. And the president has now turned the FBI, he's called the FBI scum, and he's found another election year enemy. So this is politics. Pat has a wonderful way with words, but I don't think you can.
Thank you, Ellen.
You're welcome. But I don't think you can diminish what this president has done in other areas, and Ukraine is a separate story.
We're going to talk about that, I think.
You mentioned Manafort and Flynn. Manafort is in jail not for anything to do with the campaign. He's in jail for foreign lobbying that predated the campaign. Those are his problems, and he has significant criminal problems.
Yeah.
Now, Flynn lied lied to investigators. He should be punished for that. I think he's probably being over-prosecuted.
Do you think
and
Trump will
over-punished.
pardon him based in part on the IG report?
I would say if he were to pardon Roger Stone or Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn or any of these individuals before the election, I think it would be very bad politically. I understand he may want to. I understand he may be being advised to. I think he should wait till after he gets reelected and then consider at that point. You could have commutations
or
rather
defeated.
than pardons. Or defeated. Yeah, it could certainly happen in that case. One other thing about the IG that's important to understand. The reason there's a difference between the way John Durham and Bill Barr view this and the way the IG views this is the IG has limits on what they can actually look at. They can only look in the specific agency that they are the IG for. So they can only talk to Justice Department officials. It has to be voluntary. They cannot use subpoenas. So the IG report is actually not an exhaustive look. It's detailed, it's thorough. This person's a professional, but he has a limit to how far he can go. Yeah. Durham has access to far more information and can use subpoenas to get
we'll see what he comes up testimony. With. We'll see what he comes up with and how much of it is fake news. One footnote on Paul Manafort. He was Donald Trump's campaign manager. He was at the convention and they changed the platform to be to change it with regard to Ukraine. You can't say he had nothing to do with the campaign.
Isn't there a challenge, though, for Democrats in the sense that the Durham report, you suggest, Eleanor, it might be fake news, is predicated on a criminal investigation? So there would have to be the presentation of evidence that Durham thought was beyond all reasonable doubt.
I think there's trouble, and there's trouble because we have an attorney general now who has definitely put, not a finger on this, he's put his whole arm on the scale in the favor of the president. And the fact that Durham felt compelled to make a statement contradicting the Justice Department IG report, which is completely at odds with any kind of routine in these kinds of investigations, suggests that, he's been, I don't want to say bought off, because I don't think there's an exchange of money, but I think he's in on it too.
Well, look, whatever you say about the Attorney General Barr, who I admire greatly, he was dead right when he talked about the Mueller report. There was no conspiracy, no collusion in that. In the impeachment, which we're going to deal with, nobody brought up obstruction of justice, which is what Mueller dealt with. Did they, Eleanor?
No, Barr put a completely wrong impression on the Mueller report, which politically colored the way it was regarded.
Issue 2 of moderates and impeachment.
Democrats in the House of Representatives this week finalized their articles of impeachment against President Trump. They say the president has abused his powers and undermined the national interests of the United States. Republicans vehemently disagree. They suggest this impeachment effort is about damaging the president in the run-up to the 2020 elections. But with 217 votes needed to impeach the president, and 233 Democratic members of the House, if more than 16 moderate Democrats vote against impeachment, the effort is likely to fail.
Eleanor, are Democrats at risk of losing this sort of battle for the moderate votes in impeachment?
Well, I think Nancy Pelosi's judgment here, and she's a very good vote counter, and she's tailoring the two impeachment articles to what she thinks she could get broad support for. I think there is some unhappiness on the progressive left that this president should be held to account for what Pat was talking about that was in the Mueller report, where he actually details 10 instances of obstruction of justice in the second volume of the Mueller report. And now Republicans are using the fact that Nancy Pelosi hasn't gone ahead with that as evidence that there's no there, and that's been all litigated and it's over. There's a political judgment here, yes, and I think the fact that she simultaneously announced that they were going to pass the trade bill, she wants to let the voters know that Democrats are not as obsessed with impeachment as Trump and Pat and the Republicans, but they can walk and chew gum, and they can pass that, and they're also going to pass a prescription drug cost containment bill, which is very significant.
Listen, as I used the Latin in my column this morning, the mountain went into labor and brought forth a mouse. Look, we got abuse of power, it was said. Eleanor has on this panel repeatedly said Trump colluded with Russia, Trump conspired with Russia, he's guilty of an obstruction of justice under Mueller. There's treason involved here, there is bribery here, there is extortion here, there are high crimes here. They don't mention a single crime in the whole impeachment resolution. Not a single hard crime. It's abuse of power. I mean, you sometimes abuse your power. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it is a ridiculous thing. And then the other was, what is it? Obstruction of justice? Obstruction of Congress.
Right.
In other words,
who needs Congress anyway?
No,
right?
Trump is. Look, there's an area between Congress and the presidency, which every president has fought for as much as he gets, and Congress fights back. That's what Trump is doing. He's taken. Why doesn't Congress take it to court,
contempt of
get
Congress.
the Supreme Court to decide in its
Okay.
favor?
Let's get Clarence.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I would charge contempt of Congress because that's what Trump is doing here. All along, he hasn't allowed any of his people to answer their subpoenas or respond to them, and then claims that he's not allowed to get his side out. It's just one constant fib after another.
Take it to the Supreme Court and win.
I think that, well, again, Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to spend more time than is necessary.
Well, they've asked the Supreme Court to expedite. There are 3 cases now to try to get his tax returns, and so let's see if the Supreme Court reacts.
But wait a second, Pat.
Wait a second, Pat. Adam Schiff pointed out that it took 4 months to get an initial ruling that Don McGahn, the former White House counsel, could testify, and he immediately appeals, and so another several months. The White House strategy is to just run out the clock with multiple appeals. So the Democrats have decided to go ahead with this, hold them accountable, let what happens in the Senate happen, and then let's fight it out in the 2020 election. I think that's okay.
I think Pat makes the key point, and that is that this is an impeachment in search of a crime. And the Democrats have wanted to impeach Trump from the day after he got elected. It's continued throughout. If you remember, just a few months ago, they wanted to impeach him over the Russia stuff. You don't hear anything more about that anymore.
Timing.
What's interesting is, as recently as 10 days ago, the Speaker of the House and the Intelligence Committee Chairman, Adam Schiff, both said specifically the president was guilty of bribery. An outlandish charge. In fact, the Speaker was asked this week about that charge, why it wasn't one of the articles. She said she's not a lawyer. We all would, I guess, stipulate that she's not a lawyer. What's interesting is, again, they settled on abuse of power and they settled on obstruction of Congress. To Pat's point, making an executive privilege claim, as Jonathan Turley noted, the George Washington University law professor recently, that's not an impeachable crime. The courts have to work through that. The Democrats may feel a need to do this before the end of the year, but their political timetable shouldn't determine whether something is impeachable.
It's more than feelings.
It's more than feelings. I'll come back to Pat.
No, I just want to say it's more than feelings. But the fact is, as in the Clinton impeachment, they have changed the question to, well, we know he's guilty, we know he's a schnook, but does it rise to the level of impeachment? And that's such a foggier area to debate on. That's why the Republicans are gaining some degree of spine right now.
Let me ask. Then let me ask a question, Pat. Do you think this is hurting or helping the president at the moment, politically?
In the last couple of days, it has turned 100% in Trump's favor. Look, the Democrats, they've been talking about our democracy is in peril. We have to move on this. The Republic may not stand. And then now you're talking about Pelosi thinks we ought to hold it up here and vote on this or that. Well, in other words, you're not serious.
It's a fraud.
No, you want to hold our democracy.
That's how it works. You put articles of impeachment up, and you have to get the votes. She knows how to count votes. And when this president is going to be impeached, and history's not going to look back and say, oh, it was only 2 articles and it could have been 4.
They're going to say it was all Democrats.
You're trying to make a mockery of this, but this is serious business, and history will render its judgment.
It's going to be all you've got.
And that's why Trump has tweeted 126 times in a single day. He is freaked out about this.
All right, look, I was in the Watergate thing, and when we went to the Supreme Court to defend the president's tapes and lost, you turned over the tapes. Look, this whole thing is going to be looked on in history as a partisan brawl where 100% Democrats tried to destroy a president they couldn't defeat at the polls.
Not when the historians examine his behavior, and not when anyone who is at all fair-minded or open-minded looks at what this president has done.
I think that the challenge the Democrats have to your question on whether this is helping the president is impeachment needs to be clear, needs to be overwhelming, and it needs to be bipartisan. And in this case, it's none of those 3 things. If you look at it right now as we sit here, there is far more pressure on Democrats as they are getting ready to vote on impeachment than there is on Republicans. Republicans are more unified than they've ever been. And I'll say when this story began on Ukraine, I was concerned that was not going to be how it was going to go, that Republicans were going to become divided, that there were going to be lots of bad facts, there was going to be lots of pressure. The pressure has come on Democrats, polling on independents, polling in battleground states, both moving in Trump's direction on the question of impeachment.
When Justice Roberts presides over that trial sitting in his robes, there are going to be plenty of Senate Republicans stewing.
And Democrats have also been unified, too. That's why Nancy Pelosi changed her mind and decided to push impeachment, because she was getting so much pressure from the grassroots of her districts.
And look at the charge and the abuse of power. That Trump withheld for 2 months military aid to Ukraine and thereby imperiled our national security. Obama didn't give any lethal aid for 2 years. He was sending blankets and goggles and meals ready to eat and all that. Look, how can Trump be responsible? How can Trump be responsible for imperiling U.S. national security when Obama did worse?
These are supposed to be public events, which means you're supposed to have public debate. Trump doesn't worry about debate. He just does it on his own and tried to put a lid on it, and now he's mad because he got found out.
He was leveraging U.S. military aid to an ally that's fighting Russia.
Why didn't Obama give
Let
military aid?
Let Eleanor finish.
Excuse me, in return for help on his political campaign.
Thank you.
That is a clear abuse of power, and it has nothing to do with what Obama did or didn't do. Obama wasn't leveraging anything.
I've read the articles of impeachment. It mentions our national security being imperiled.
That's right.
Like, if Obama didn't send any lethal aid in 3 years after the Russians moved into the east of Ukraine, did he not imperil our national security?
Wait. But Pat, to abuse my power against you, isn't the challenge here, though, that as Eleanor says, it's not simply withholding aid as President Obama did, it's withholding aid for a political effect that is undue.
Okay, let's say it may be true that Trump said, you're not getting an Oval Office meeting until we get the Burisma.
Bury the Bidens with Burisma.
File. So send the file, you get the meeting. That you're going to overthrow the government of the United States for that?
It's not overthrowing the government. It's holding a president accountable. He's not above the rule of law, which is a phrase that so many Republicans used so often. Now it's my turn to use it.
Has anyone seen a weaker charge of impeachment in their lifetime than this?
We don't have that many impeachments, Pat. That's the thing.
We've had two in my lifetime.
I think
you're
they were both
impeached
deserved.
or you're not impeached. I know Trump says this is impeachment light. The penalty is the same, and that is that black mark on his legacy, which is why he's quite upset.
Yeah, go ahead.
And should be.
One of the things that's interesting here, and I've written about this, I think the Post has as well, but I was first.
Noted.
Rudy Giuliani, with his cell phone conversations from Ukraine, almost certainly has the Russians listening in on some of those calls. Do you think 2020 could be the year of another Russian surprise, this time against the president?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that there's an easy way to answer that at this stage. Look, I think most people who have studied this agree that Russia interfered in the election, that's not an open question. Mm-hmm. The question that is before the Congress is whether the president should be impeached on these two counts based on the evidence that's been presented. The only group that's under pressure right now is 10 or 15 or maybe 20 moderate House Democrats, 10 or 12 of whom met this week to consider pushing censure instead of impeachment as something that they could support. So you had 2 Democrats vote against the inquiry vote on the floor to let the impeachment go forward. I suspect you may have 5 or as many as 10 vote. Maybe vote yes on one article, no on the other, or vote no on both. That's the group to watch.
Let me respond to Eleanor's point. They had the impeachment of Andrew Johnson for violating the Tenure of Office Act. He fired the Secretary of War, who was a hardliner for Reconstruction. And John F. Kennedy, in his book Profile in Courage, declared a profile in courage the one United States senator that stood up and rejected that outrageous charge against Johnson. It may be the same with Donald Trump.
Eleanor, you can have a response next time. But on that note,
I don't need to respond to that one.
On that note, predictions, Pat.
Predictions. I think Jeremy Corbyn will not be in office when next we meet.
Okay, that's probably a good one.
Labor leader.
Eleanor.
The strong job numbers from November are a wake-up call for Democrats who've got to do a better job countering this president on the economy. You're going to hear Democrats start talking about jobs, good jobs. They've been remiss to wait this long to get around to it.
Who do you think is the best placed Democrat to make that case?
I continue to think that Joe Biden is the leading candidate for a number of reasons, but he needs to he has some plans out, but he needs to be aggressive about that, because history shows us strong economy like this is a good path to re-election.
Two good ones so far. What's yours, Matt?
There's been discussion recently about designating the Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. There's a move in Congress led by Congressman Chip Roy, H.R. 1700, which has gotten some attention. The president recently said he wants to do it. I think it's being held up right now because of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is going to pass the House next week and pass the Senate in January. As soon as that's clear, I believe the president will designate those cartels as terrorist organizations, allow them to freeze assets, allow them to prevent cartel leaders from entering the United States, some other things that are important.
Lopez Obrador doesn't want it, though, so we'll see. Clarence, your prediction.
President Trump has signed an executive order which would take federal funding away from colleges or universities that allow anti-Semitic activities. That's kind of poor phrasing of it, but you got the idea. I expect this to be to run into a roadblock in the courts. ACLU is preparing for it already. All they need is a case.
Okay. All right. I predict, I'm going to slightly disagree, even though I said he was right on this with Pat. I think Jeremy Corbyn will hang on in there for the next few months, primarily because although he's lost the remaining Labour MPs he has, the base of the Labour Party is to the far left. It is Corbyn territory still, but he's doomed ultimately. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you next time.